all-powerful businessman contemplated his work. The market had expanded his empire to encompass the earth. Resources were being exploited as never before. However, many riches still eluded him. Riches that a few dreamers naively attempted to withhold from the market in the name of the common good. For the businessman, this notion of the common good had become the single obstacle standing between him and his ultimate goal, to transform the entire planet into a commodity and declare the total market. So he set off on a business trip that would change the face of the earth. Since the beginning of time, the amount of water on the earth had remained unchanged. The same could not be said, however, for its quality. The businessman, a master at exploiting scarcity, believed there was no longer a choice. It was time to make water a commodity and let the market's invisible hand regulate its trade.
Looking at the water situation around the world, we very fast began to realize that there was a shortage of water all over the planet. And with this lake here, I mean, it's a very unique lake, very good quality of water, and we just got the idea of looking to do something with it, you know, to get it out and to market the water. Like the flow from Gisborne Lake, of course, it's 100 million cubic meters a year. So we were looking at taking 25 million, which is 1/4 of the flow from the lake. If you try to stockpile it, where's it going to go? Can't be done. It's going to go anyway.
I think that if you say there's an excess of water, that you're taking a very narrow view of what water does. Really, what that fresh water does when it reaches the ocean is it floats on top of the salt water. And as it moves out, it mixes up the nutrients and everything that is in the salty water down below and makes the places where rivers flow in, those estuaries, very, very productive.
I had to do a 2.5 or 3 year environmental impact study, and anybody else that want to take water from Newfoundland or anywhere else are going to have to do the same studies. It all has to be done. And then if there's available water, if it's a surplus of water, then we should sell it. It should go. We should do it.
Any province that starts to export bulk water for commercial purposes basically triggers the North American Free Trade Agreement. Therefore, water will become a tradable commodity just like anything else, cars or widgets or whatever else. That means that you can't favor your domestic private sector. You'll have to allow American corporations in. That means you can't just say one province can export it, but others can't. That means that once the tap is turned on to the United States or other NAFTA countries, we can't turn it off. We can't diminish it. We can only allow it to become greater. And we can place no environmental restrictions on that because that's a good between the two countries.
Today, of course, the moratorium is on, but the federal government seems to be not so hard to stand on bulk water anymore. I think they're beginning to realize that we have a resource here that's worth some money, and I think it's a good thing. You know, it's almost like saying that you're not going to sell your water. It's almost like saying Saudi Arabia saying, look, we're not going to sell our oil. It's the same thing.
We speak of these things as resources. And we do the same thing with iron and copper and nickel and things like this. But in all of these sorts of things, you have a choice. You know, if you don't use the iron, well, maybe the nickel would do as well. Or if you don't use the oil, well, maybe gas or something would do as well. But water is very, very different from this because there is no alternative. There is only water. It is the essential ingredient of life. If you don't have water, you don't have life.
When there was more water, once it subsided, people would plant squash, melons, corn. Well, that's finished now. There's no more agriculture, no more fish since the river disappeared. The water used to rise all the way to this post. We needed a barrier to protect against it. There was lots of it. Back in those days, the river was twice as wide as it is today.
And why is there no more water?
Well, it's because the United States holds it back, so it doesn't come.
This is a man-made delivery canal. It's called the All-American Canal. It takes water from the Colorado River to the Imperial Irrigation District. This canal takes so much water that it, more than any other canal or many other structures on the Colorado River, is the fundamental cause of the death of the Colorado River. This is the Imperial Valley Irrigation District, located in one of the driest deserts in the world. You know, in an area that gets less than 3 inches of rainfall a year, you have crops like alfalfa and wheat and many livestock. It's a huge landscape of agribusiness. It's not agriculture, it's agribusiness. On top of the former desert ecosystem, there is no living with the ecosystem. This is a place where resources are exploited and the goods are taken elsewhere for market. So it's not a question of people needing water, it's a question of big business needing water. Water belongs to the ecosystem from which it comes. That's the only way to look at water if we are to balance conservation of the ecosystem with use. Instead, people, especially in the United States, look upon water only as a commodity, only something to use for profit. And when that mentality is held up so high, you lose all other values.
I think it's time that we had a little drink of Gisborne Lake. Very clear, cool water. That's a very good water, there's no doubt. I would recommend it to anybody.
We do have to ask ourselves what we owe as a water-rich country to the rest of the world. We have to have that debate within the framework of water as part of the commons. Should it be priced? I don't know, let's talk about it, but not if it's going to some bottom-line investor to make a profit from. Should it be sold and traded? No. Should it be shared? Maybe, but it should be shared on humanitarian grounds. What these corporations are talking about, what these businessmen are talking about, what the trade agreements are talking about is taking water from the good, as a common good, to making it a private commodity and then controlling it and selling it for profit. This means that that water will get to those corporations or those cities or those places that can afford to buy it, and it will never get to the millions and millions of the world's people who are desperately needing it.
The birds that you hear, they're just like us. They've been denied the right to water as well. The little water that makes it this far is barely enough to survive on. If there's no water, we can't live. Even the air no longer belongs to us because it's polluted. Today, nothing is treated with respect anymore. For us, water is something that is sacred. But for the others, it's just a commodity.
And the businessman contemplated his work and saw that it was good for the shareholders. The businessman knew one thing. In the knowledge era, intellectual property would assure him the same power as the ownership of factories had during the industrial era. On the second day, he therefore started tapping knowledge, beginning with that of the ancient peoples.
ये हमारा पेड़ होता है, कौन पेड़ है, बहुत नीम बोलते हैं इसको। ये इसकी पत्ती है जो ब्लड प्योरीफायर काम करती हैं। हमारा यूनानी मेडिसिन में ये साफ़ी में इस्तेमाल होती है और साफ़ी एक बहुत अच्छा हमारा का प्रोडक्ट है जो ब्लड प्योरीफायर काम करता है। अक्सर पेट की खराबी वगैरह भी दूर करता है। ये सैंडलवुड होता है, संदल, चंदन, अक्सर ये दर्द सर में भी काम आती है। इसको घिसने के बाद इसका जो पेस्ट बनाता है उसको अगर माथे पे लगाया जाए तो उससे दर्द दूर हो जाता है। ये टर्मरिक है, ये हमारा यहाँ यूनानी दवाओं में काम आती है। खसूसी हमारा जो हमदुराइड कैप्सूल होता है ये उसके काम आता है। अमेरिका इसको आज पेटेंट करना चाह रहा है, जबकि हमारा हज़ारों साल से इसकी दवाएं बन रही हैं और हमारा ये दवाओं में इस्तेमाल हो रही है।
Corporations are taking our plants, are taking our knowledge and saying that they are their inventions. Companies like Rice Tech claiming basmati to be their invention. Companies like W.R. Grace and the U.S. Department of Agriculture claiming to have invented the use of neem as a director indica for agriculture, for pest control and fungal control. Of companies claiming to have invented the digestive properties of pepper, which we have used. Black pepper has been in use in India for millennia. Of turmeric for wound healing, of ginger for colds. Hundreds of plants that we have used, everyday knowledge of our mothers and grandmothers, claim to be an invention.
इसमें सुकारी, इसमें कीड़ा कोई वो ना लग सके इसमें तो ये लग जाए सुरसुरी, इसमें कोई दिमक दमक कोई ना लगा। बचपन से जब ही हम करने लगा बड़ा देखे अपना, फिर हम करने लगा, फिर मार बालक देखे ये वे भी करने लग जाएगा। डालो इसे, न डालो।
People describe India as a rich country where poor people live. What is our richness due to? Biodiversity, traditional knowledge, our intellectual prowess and so on. But we have remained poor because we have not created wealth out of it. If you look at the herbal product market last year, it was $61 billion. By 2020, it is expected to be $5 trillion. So therefore, these markets are going to be very, very large indeed. And for that, what are the attributes that you require? You require rich biodiversity, and you require the research and development effort to use that, not just to look at it and admire it and protect it, but use that to create new products.
We have been producing oleoresins, which are a compounded extract of from pepper. Okay. One of the primary constituents of these oleoresins is piperine. Piperine is what gives the heat in the pepper, the spice. And it has always been used as a bioavailability enhancer in the traditional Ayurvedic science, which India has practiced for centuries. We began exploring the opportunities to try and sell the isolated piperine to the nutraceuticals and the pharmaceutical markets, where the new use is being propagated and found useful. As we increased our sales and marketing efforts in that North American market, we received a notice from a company based in North America that the notice claimed that the company has a patent in extracting piperine and purifying piperine. they have trademarked it and called it bioperine, and that since they had a patent on it, they were keen that they would protect their markets and using their patent rights effectively. If I was a pharmaceutical company and I was discovering a new drug and somebody already had a patent on it, and I would respect that. I would say, that's fine. Yeah, I can't just copy that and then expect to own the same rights. It's just not possible. But this is natural. This has been going on for centuries.
In this century of knowledge, if India doesn't want to remain poor, I think we have to learn the game. Therefore, there is a massive movement that we have started on patent literacy, intellectual property literacy, in the academia, in the universities, in industry, and so on and so forth. My own laboratories are becoming patent savvy. For example, in terms of foreign patents, 4 years ago we just had filed 50 foreign patents. The following year 100. Last year it was 200. This year I'm very happy to say 450 patents have been filed. People are getting used to it. And people are also finding that by licensing patents, they are able to create wealth for the institution, for the nation, and partly, of course, for themselves. Why not?
The moment you have taken a patent, even an Indian, you have started the floodgates to the privatization of life. And anyone taking a patent on what is a commons is creating an enclosure of that commons. The real response to biopiracy is to keep seeds, plants, animals' knowledge in the commons.
इसमें जैव संपदा का रजिस्टर है, ये सारे गांव की पंचायत का, और इसमें अलग अलग अनाज, फल, घरेलू जो फलदार पेड़ होते हैं या जो जड़ी बूटियां होती हैं, हमारे आसपास जितनी भी जड़ी बूटियां हैं उसकी सूची है इसके अंदर। इसलिए जरूरत पड़ी क्योंकि लोग जो है जितने भी बीज इत्यादि हैं, जो भी जड़ी बूटियां हैं, उन सब का एकाधिकार कर रहे थे बाहर की कंपनियां।
If people have to say no to patents, the first thing they have to recognize is they have the knowledge. They know how to make things, they know how to grow crops, they know how to evolve seed, and they know how to make medicine from their medicinal plants. So the Community Biodiversity Register allows younger generations to develop respect for the grandmothers and mothers and their teachers and the older people. The other thing it does is empowers the community. As a community, starts to think of itself as collective. It starts to think about the common good. It starts to say, this biodiversity is ours, collectively. This knowledge is ours, collectively. Now, once that consciousness is established, remembered, and settled, no one can say, pay us royalty for this seed, pay us royalty for this medicine. It's impossible to work patents in that culture of the common good, of the common heritage of knowledge and biodiversity.
Has taken a government the size of India with its historical opposition to the patent system, and with a crop as important as basmati or neem, where they've actually come to fight. Most developing countries and most farmers or indigenous people have absolutely no capacity whatsoever to take on those challenges, and they don't even know about them. I mean, again, the average cost of litigation of $1.5 million, and we're recognizing that these are national laws, and therefore, if you're an indigenous community, you've got to have lawyers available in Munich for the European patent system, in Washington for the US, and in Tokyo for the Japanese system, in order to defend your patent or defend your rights. It's impossible. So 99% of the time, the indigenous communities have not the slightest idea that they've been ripped off.
And the businessman contemplated his work and saw that it was good for the shareholders. Often during his travels, the businessman would become very annoyed by the bothersome ability of plants to reproduce. Then, an extraordinarily bold idea came to him. To put an end to this wasteful situation, the businessman decreed that from that time forward, seeds and all they begat would become private property.
Well, here, look, well, for Pete's sakes, look here again. It's all over again, the same as 1997. Look at all the canola plants that are growing here. One plant like this will produce from 4 to 10,000 seeds the next year. So this field, if I don't cultivate it or use some special chemical, it will be totally polluted with Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. Monsanto can come out with a genetic altered canola plant, put it into the environment, damage and destroy my seed, and then get a lawsuit against because you're letting it grow on your land. Because they ruled it doesn't matter how it gets on your land, if it blows in or cross-pollinates or falls off of farm equipment, it's Monsanto's property. The judge said that I must give the seed and the plant to Monsanto. How can I give millions and millions of plants in my field all over? How am I supposed to get the plants out and give it to Monsanto? It's impossible. What gives Monsanto the right, in the first place, to receive permission to get a patent on a life-giving form? If we plant the seed the first time, when it reproduces the second time, they should no longer have a claim to that because they didn't reproduce it. The farmer reproduced it, and the farmer really didn't produce it. It was nature, it was the sun, the soil, and basically an act of God. I can't make a seed grow. Monsanto can't make a seed grow. Only nature can make a seed grow.
Whether or not you can invent life is a different question from whether or not you can invent a new seed. In order to be patentable, the subject matter, a new seed, must be new, it must be useful, and it must be non-obvious. You know, it is certainly possible to develop innovations in seeds through a variety of techniques, including recombinant DNA and biotechnology, but not limited to those. You know, if you want to increase innovation of that sort, patents are a very effective way of doing so.
The multinational companies like Monsanto do not want farmers to use their own seed. They want a farmer to come back, buy their seed every year, and then you have to buy their chemicals. You got to pay $15 an acre technology charge. You got to sign an agreement that you never use your own seed. So it takes the complete rights away from a farmer. Monsanto's police force can come on your land, we call them gene police, and go on your land for 3 years after you've grown it, go in your granaries, check your fields, grow and check the seed in your granaries to see if you're not cheating. If Monsanto has to lower itself to a gutter-type level of a policy to sell their product, and in selling their product need a police force, something is wrong with the thinking and their policy of a company. To me, it's just plain wrong, wrong, wrong.
No one compels a farmer to choose one seed over another. He or she always retains the freedom to choose. If a farmer finds the right or privilege of saving seed to replant it more valuable to him or her than the added value that he or she will get from planting seed that they purchase every year from a company which holds a patent, then they're free to do so.
They destroyed 53 years' work of seed development that I had done, and my seed was resistant to some of the diseases that we have here on the prairies in canola. All that is destroyed. I phoned up 2 seed companies in the last 3 weeks. I said I wanted pure, conventional, non-GMO canola seed, and they laughed at me. They said there is no such thing. They will not guarantee it. The companies have succeeded in contaminating all the canola supplies in Canada. So there is no such thing as choice.
Well, the idea that farmers have a choice under a system controlled by corporations is totally false. Because the corporations first ensure that farmers lose their seed. They go into regions and buy up all the traditional varieties, then sell their own seeds. They deliberately create a seed famine, and I have witnessed it in regions where the corporations have entered in India. The creation of a seed famine where only one kind of crop is available, and the farmers have nothing left. In that condition, to say the farmers have a choice is as false as it is to tell a bonded laborer that they have a choice to go and work anywhere. The idea of Navdanya as a commitment, my commitment for the rest of my life, is basically to have a biodiversity sanctuary, both to conserve the diverse species that we are losing, but not just to conserve them as a museum, not just to have it in museumized form, but to have them as seeds that farmers can collect and go into self-sufficiency, go into sustainability.
हम जब से इस संस्था से जुड़े हैं ना, ये लोग हम जो भी बीज कम पड़ता है हम इन लोगों से लेते हैं बीज। कोई भी बीज है हमको दे देते हैं, जैसे मक्की है, धान है, मटर है, हर चीज सरसों है, कोई भी चीज है ये लोग देते हैं। 1 किलो ये देते हैं, हम लौटा के इनको 2 किलो वापस करते हैं। कोई सफेद कोई लाल को।
For me, it was absolutely key for the defense of the plants' freedom and the defense of farmers' freedom to have seeds that were free of patents, free of genetic manipulation. And to us, Navdanya is an expression of the continued freedom of nature to evolve on her terms, as well as the farmers to be free of being bonded to the few handful of giant corporations that want to own every aspect of life, of the life of the planet and our own lives. A simple calculation that activists have done worldwide shows that patents on seed, and this would be pirated patents because most of the genetic resources and biodiversity which is being patented comes from the third world, patents would increase the debt burden on third world countries tenfold. The third world is already reached its limits of survival with the present debt. The debt created by this piracy would wipe out possibilities of life under conditions of poverty that have been created through colonialism and various waves of ingenious transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. And this is the last attempt being made.
And the businessman contemplated his work and saw that it was good for the shareholders. Forever in search of new territories to conquer, the businessman turned to things infinitely small, the territories that lie within the human body. The fabric of life represented a new opportunity for profit. The market's invisible hand should be allowed to extract it.
Myriad Genetics has patented a test for the predisposition of breast and ovarian cancer based on analysis of the BRCA1 gene sequence. This is one of the breast cancer susceptibility genes, so Myriad basically patented the reference sequence, meaning the standard or norm. Anyone using this reference sequence, regardless of the method used, is infringing on Myriad's industrial property rights. We decided to oppose this monopoly because conducting these genetic tests is something necessary. In the short term for the treatment of women at risk, but also over the longer term to improve this treatment. And that's why a monopoly would restrict the research carried out.
My grandmother died of ovarian cancer following breast cancer. My mother died 25 years ago of breast cancer, and my sister died of breast cancer 4 years ago. So, earlier this year, when I discovered that I had cancer, I wasn't overly surprised. I learned that the cancer was hereditary through the test offered by Dr. Stopa-Lyonnais' genetic oncology department. That radically changed my perception of the disease, because although 3 generations of the family had been afflicted, we had nonetheless carried this burden without understanding why. By taking the test, I came away with answers about my family situation, but I also hope it will contribute to the research being done in this area, the area of predictive medicine.
Once you have the other blood sample? I was part of a cancer genetics network, which is a grant-funded operation for 8 cancer centers in the United States. It's funded by National Cancer Institute. And my involvement in that project was to set up a core lab so that we can offer genetic testing for all the cancer susceptibility genes for all the research projects that will go through this cancer genetics network. And that definitely included BRCA1 and 2 testing also. But a year later, we got a letter from the company Myriad Genetics, which has the patent on BRCA1 gene. They sent us this letter and saying that, you know, we are infringing on their patent. So we stopped. If you can come up with a method which is as good as sequencing but less expensive, there needs to be research that goes to develop such techniques. But at the moment, even if you come up with such a technique, you cannot use it because you'll be stopped because of the patent.
I think that a new and important debate is coming. This time, it will be about using the sequence for prevention and treatment. If another company or business perfects a drug that allows for the prevention of breast cancers, and specifically cancers linked to an alteration in the BRCA1 gene, then Myriad would have rights over that invention. This patent has raised the entire issue of the patentability of genes and their future application, since we're dealing with the future here.
This is a very expensive business. To produce this drug at the end of this effort is about $500 million. If you do not have strong patent protection, not only for the drug at the end of the pipeline, but also for the intellectual property that's involved in identifying the gene and its function, nobody is going to partake in this effort.
You know, at the turn of the last century, when the chemists were isolating the chemical elements in the periodic table, they and their companies put a lot of time and research into it. but we didn't allow them to claim patents on the actual products in the periodic table. We allowed them process patents. Those are patents on the processes they use to isolate the chemical elements in nature. But can you imagine any country allowing a patent on helium, oxygen, aluminum, hydrogen, titanium? It's ridiculous. We didn't allow it. Simply stated, these are discoveries of nature. The genes are exactly analogous. By what stretch of the imagination can a biotech company say they invented a gene that's the result of millions of years of evolution? The breast cancer gene, the cystic fibrosis gene, the Huntington chorea gene, these are discoveries of nature. Therefore, no matter what amount of money they put into it, it's not an invention, therefore it doesn't qualify.
Any of this genetics research is not valid unless the patient chooses to participate in that. It's their genetic material that the researchers study to find out what's the defect, what causes the disease. Now, if the patient is told at that point that yes, today your blood will be used to find a gene that causes your disease, but tomorrow that information will be available to you only if you agree to buy that service from a particular company, I don't know how many of those patients would want to participate in this research. And I think that's the bottom line.
Ce gène fait partie de mon intégrité.
This gene is part of who I am. And even if it is the smallest entity in the human body, it's an integral part of my physical makeup. I also share it with other families. So it's mine, and it isn't. And in the broadest sense, it's common property. It represents something that I inherited from my mother, and she inherited it from her mother. It's what we call the gene pool. And it's a term, a notion, which in my opinion has no place in business, because it would then mean that the human body has a market value.
Now imagine our children, if they grow up in a world where they think of human beings at the conceptual stages as invention, when they think of the genes, the proteins, the cells, the organs, the tissues, and even whole species as inventions. What happens to the intrinsic value of life when our children's generation grows up to believe that life is simply utility, intellectual property?
The original purpose of patents was to serve the public interest, that of investors and their investment, and that of researchers and patients, to allow for better treatments. But today, as we see with myriad genetics, we are witnessing a shift in the rights conferred by these patents, and we're no longer in the realm of public interest.
I think we need to do the right thing here. The right thing is we need to understand the gene pool as a commons. It's a trust. It's our responsibility as part of the legacy of evolution on this planet. We ought to treat it with that kind of respect. We should craft a great treaty to establish the gene pool, micro, plant, animal, and human, as a shared responsibility in which all the governments of the world become the signatories to this idea of the gene pool as a commons. If this patent policy is not challenged, in less than 10, 15 years, giant life science companies will actually own the genetic blueprints of the human species. And they will increasingly own the genetic blueprints of all of the other species that make up millions of years of evolution. That gives them tremendous power to dictate the terms upon which the rest of us enter the age of biology, the biotech century.
And the businessman contemplated his work and saw that it was good for the shareholders. For some time, the businessman had set his sights on the public services. He had patiently put into place the shortages necessary to achieve his goal. The moment had come. From now on, disease would become a business opportunity and suffering a source of profit.
So where is it you're preparing to go?
I'm going to the hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, not too far from here, for a hip operation. The surgeon explained to me. He said, if it was up to me, I'd operate on you tomorrow. That's what he said.
That was 8 months ago.
Yes, a full 8 months ago. But you know the budget cuts. He said that before the budget cuts, he could do 3 such operations a week. But now, he's only allowed to do 1 a week. But you have to understand that the pain of osteoarthritis is horrible. It's violent pain, day and night. And the nights, at least in my case, are worse than the days.
The waiting lists are a result of political decisions made by the government. With all of the budget cuts in health care, hospital closings, forced retirement of doctors and nurses, everything has been done to save money on the backs of the people and their health.
De la santé de la population. Le gouvernement a donné comme raison, c'est que
the rationale of the government is that it has to achieve a zero deficit. But at the same time, it's investing more and more in big corporations, contending that it's good for the economy. That's not true.
C'est une façon
It's just a way to siphon money away from the public system and give it to big business. And at the same time, to force people to consider going private for their health care.
Les gens veulent avoir des services, ils s'attendent à une qualité de soins, ils s'attendent à une qualité
People want the services and they expect to receive high quality care. They want to receive the treatment that best meets their needs. They receive this kind of service from veterinarians for their pets. And clearly, in some cases, they have difficulty receiving the same level of service in the public sector.
T'es malade, t'es malade. T'as mal, t'as mal. If
Quebecers and Canadians want the latest in healthcare, if they want quick access to medical care and magnetic imaging, and if at the same time they don't want to see their taxes increase exponentially or at least significantly, then I think that private care will continue to expand.
The governments say, but we can reduce your taxes. By how much? A few $100s or even $1,000 or $2,000? But we'll have to pay $12,000 a year for private insurance. And we don't even know whether the insurance companies will sell us insurance if we're too old, too sick, or too poor to pay.
This is an inner city public Montessori elementary school, and once a week the school gives us space and we run a free clinic. In a country that is so rich, still there's so many people, there's over 40 million people here without insurance. who don't have access to health care. At the same time that you have this brilliant technological advances, you have one of the highest infant mortalities in the developed world. And that's because we have a small group who can get brilliant advances and many people who have access to nothing.
Yeah, a pretty bad infection. He needs to go to the ED.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, that's
so,
what I thought.
Let's call a taxi.
Okay.
We don't even need to go there.
Okay.
This shoe is amazing. Look at this thing. I mean, that's how, they were taking care of it. And it's not any fault of theirs. It's just, sometimes you don't have access to the better medical care. So.
We are trying to make a difference one person at a time. Even though we need to make a difference in the whole country, sometimes those changes take very long to occur. There are powerful forces that are preventing them, that are going to take care of their own vested interests, like the insurance companies, like the pharmaceutical companies.
I began my work in managed care, working as a medical reviewer, and very quickly, I was told as a physician I was expected to keep a certain % of a denial rate, that I wasn't to trust what physicians said about their patients, that I was to try to find ways to keep them out of the hospital. And there was a dramatic moment where a request came across my desk that involved a patient that required a heart transplant in a hospital outside of our network, which would have been very expensive. We would have had to pay full charges. And so I was expected to deny this. And when I guess the gravity of what I was doing was brought home when I called his physician, and I told him, I said, we can't approve this. And he said, you've just issued a death sentence. After years of reflection, I realized that I, as a physician, had caused the death of a man. And instead of being held accountable morally and professionally, I was promoted. I got better jobs as a result of it. I was a better medical director. I received accolades, for being tough enough to make the kind of economic decision that saved a company, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
How can you leave health to the market forces? How can you leave someone's health, someone's happiness to the market? It's not like fish. It's not a commodity that's to be bought and sold. Health is part of the right of every individual in a community or in a society. It's part of a sign of a mature society. It's a society that's ready to take responsibility for the health and well-being of every individual that lives in that country.
At the end of the day, it comes down to values. What do we, as a society, want? Do we believe in the common good, or do we want a system that will provide special care to a select few? If that's the kind of choice we're ready to make, then let's do it. But I believe that the majority of the population don't want to sacrifice their health so that a few corporate shareholders can become wealthy. And that's what the government is doing to us. We're in the process of being duped.
And the businessman contemplated his work and saw that it was good for the shareholders. The businessman had long been wary of the state, the political institution that citizens had established to assure the common good. So he put considerable effort into making the state work in his interest. But that day, the businessman learned that the game was far from won.
Há 5 anos,
as indústrias brasileiras, principalmente oficiais,
5 years ago, Brazilian companies, mostly the publicly owned companies, began copying antiretrovirus drugs, which according to our law were not patented.
por patentes. Estamos produzindo.
We produce these drugs and are able to offer them at a cost that is 80% lower than that of the patented medications.
Medicamentos de marca. Os próximos medicamentos que nós
The drugs we'll need next are protected by our new patent laws.
segundo a lei nacional.
So we've begun negotiating with the big laboratories and hope to reach an agreement.
Para ver se chegamos a algum acordo. Se não chegarmos a acordo,
If we can't, the government has decided to infringe on the patents, which, by the way, there is provision for in the law. In cases of national emergency and in the public interest, we are authorized to infringe on the patents.
A romper a patente.
When I was diagnosed as HIV positive in 1990, the drugs I needed were not yet provided by the government. At that time, they cost between $1,200 and $1,500 American dollars a month. That's about what I was making at the time, $1,200, $1,500 a month, depending on the exchange rate.
Em torno de $1.500. Tchau, obrigado. Então, na verdade, a medicação
In fact, the distribution of free medication has allowed Brazilians to live with the virus and no longer just die from it.
E não apenas a morrer de AIDS.
Nous avons une baisse de mortalité.
We have seen death reduced by about 50% since 1996. That was when we began the program. We have medications like these, which we buy from multinational companies. That means they're still making money from us. And we have medications like these, which are produced here in Brazil and are generic. For patients, there's no cost for either.
What choice does the Brazilian government have if it wants to save its people? Can it afford not to provide the drugs? I believe it's obliged to provide them by applying the compulsory license law, which the United States questions, but which nonetheless is allowed through international agreements. I know that patents exist to protect the investments made by the companies, but you can't lose sight of the right to life. No return on investment justifies the death of a human being anywhere in the world.
International trade laws and patents don't exist to protect anyone's life. They exist to protect the capital of multinational corporations. That's capitalist logic, right? So, to a certain extent, we're trying to shatter this logic because we know that it can't guarantee the well-being of the population in every respect.
Não podemos considerar o medicamento como qualquer
You
outro
can't consider
produto de
drugs
consumo.
as simply consumer
A nossa
products.
discussão é que
What we're trying to emphasize is that the prices, and particularly the profits of these big corporations, are overblown. They have nothing at all to do with the real value of the product, even when profits and future investments are taken into account. It's all out of proportion, and that's the real question.
The businessman was becoming very irritated. Comments like these would be of serious concern to the shareholders. The time for rest had not yet come. The businessman knew he would have to do something to thwart the political institutions. On the 7th day, he held a great summit. Fearful of being left out, all the heads of state came running. The meeting agenda, kept secret from the people, could not have been clearer. Abolish all national regulations that might stand in the way of business, and, above all, force countries to surrender the responsibility for the common good to market forces, or face severe sanctions.
The Canadian government has agreed to pay $13 million in damages to the American company Ethyl Corporation. Ethyl produces a gasoline additive that Canada has judged to be harmful to health.
The American government will apply sanctions to the European Union following the ban on European imports of hormone-treated beef.
Courier UPS has accused Canada Post of unfair competition and is suing the Canadian government for $140 million. A UPS victory could impact the scope of all Canadian social programs.
The NAFTA Tribunal has ordered the Mexican government to pay $16.5 million to Metalclad, an American company specializing in the burial of toxic waste.
What's happening with these trade agreements, and particularly this Chapter 11 of NAFTA, where corporations can for the first time sue governments of another country, what's happening is it has created a constitutional body of law that overrides domestic law, including environmental, health, and safety laws. So governments are basically relinquishing their sovereignty and their right to establish regulations and standards to provide social programs for their people to transnational corporations and international trade agreements. And basically they can say, well, poor us, it wasn't our fault. Of course we got elected promising to keep public health care, but alas, we had to lose it through these trade agreements.
If we continue to enclose all of the great ecological commons into property owned by a few companies, we risk increasing geopolitical tensions, increasing possibilities of war, increasing reduction of the earth to utility and just to resource management. What I'm saying here, I want to be clear, is we need balance. I believe we have to have commerce. I believe that we need to have a market. But it can't be the sole arbiter for how we relate to each other, our common nature in the earth we live in. When commerce becomes the sole arbiter, then we end up to be just a crass, commercial, utilitarian-based civilization. We lose our humanity, we lose our intimacy, we lose our empathy, we lose what makes life important.
If good is not common, if there's no common good, and there's only private good, that private good is hurting someone somewhere on this planet, some species somewhere. When humanity works and does agriculture as if it's the only community that has to be fed, and works against the common good of other species, we get non-sustainable agriculture. We eventually undermine our own food security. Common good is the result of give and take. It's a result of reciprocity. It's a result of mutuality. Forgetting the common good is a result of grabbing, piracy, and theft. And of course, some people prosper, but they prosper at the cost of others, and they prosper at the cost of the planet. That kind of prosperity is not prosperity.
I believe that if we do not maintain the concept of a commons, that our collective interests are served through institutions that see us as more than our individual selves, but as a sum of something larger. if we don't see natural resources and nature as something that belongs to the earth and all humanity, if we don't see that we have certain fundamental rights as human beings and citizens to have social services, social programs, if we lose that notion of the commons, I think we're going to find a world in which nothing is valued except if it has money. And in that kind of world, many, many, many people will die. Many people are dying because only those who can afford to live in that system can buy a clean environment, can buy clean water, can buy the kind of food that the rest of the world doesn't have. Only those people will live. So the keeping of the commons is not only a keeping of a set of values and of a heritage, but without a commons, without the notion of a commons, we won't survive.
That day, the invisible hand of the market showed itself for what it was.